Like we remain, our plan B is just those of us on the committee to just have a conversation. We didn't know if anyone was going to come. I thought that we could start with a minute's attunement. You can have a meditate on the hangover, but also perhaps think about people you know who have suffered from drug policy in one way or another, whether it's through overdose or illness. So we'll start now. Welcome everybody. My name is Cara Lavan. I'm from Bristol Green Party. I'm the co-coordinator of the Drug Policy Working Group, along with Jules Levy, who isn't at a conference. And I'm a filmmaker by trade. I joined the Green Party because of its drug policy. It's an absolutely standout drug policy. No other political party is prepared to put forward a policy that's potentially politically unacceptable or is hard to get across to the public. But once you understand this policy fully, it's an absolute no-brainer. Anyone I have a conversation with, they're like, why isn't this policy? So it's the big challenge for us really is how to get people to understand this is a no-brainer. And one day people will look back on drug policy in the same way we now look at the smoking ban, like what were we thinking? We were smoking in airplanes, we were smoking in buses, we were smoking in schools even. And one day we were like, what the hell were we doing for all these years? So we're here to sort of share some of the policy and some of the many aspects in which drug policy is damaging and to illustrate that drugs get blamed for the ills which are actually created by drug policy. So to begin with, this is Carrie Hamilton, who's one of the people who co-wrote the Green Party's drug policy. So she's going to outline.
Can you speak me? Oh, maybe not. Not in the best place.
What the policy is.
So is this a good place for me to be? No, I need to be near the microphone. Sorry. All right. A, I'm bad at tech, and B, okay, good. Yeah, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, especially, as Cara said, on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. when we had a really long day yesterday. I'm Carrie Hamilton. I'm from the Hackney Green Party, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you about the history of our policy, our drug policy, and kind of pulling out some key points. It was 5 years ago, kind of in the autumn of 2018, that two members of the Hackney Green Party, Zoe Garbett, who will be coming up any moment, who's of course our mayoral candidate for London this coming year, and Alex Armitage, who's now a councillor in Shetland, in Scotland, both coming from a health context, decided that it would be a good idea to look at the party's very outdated drug policy, which I think had last been revised in about 1990, so it was good 30 years old, and think about rewriting it. So we then began a process of a year, and it's worth, I don't know how many of you have been involved in writing policy or revising policy, but it was a year of a lot of work. There were about kind of maybe half a dozen to 10 of us who worked pretty steadily over that year, doing consultation with groups like Transform Anyone's Child, which I'm sure Alex will say and Cara will both talk about. So talking to drug reform charities, also and lots of scientists, experts, journalists have been following the so-called war on drugs for years. reading a lot of the evidence, and thinking a lot about the kind of language we wanted to use in the policy. And I'm happy to say that it was passed unanimously with one very small friendly amendment in 4 years ago in 2019. Hopefully most of you have had a chance to look at the actual policy, but I'm just going to kind of read you the aim just to get us started: to end the prohibition of drugs and create a system of legal regulation to minimize the harms associated with drug use, production, and supply as part of an inclusive, supportive, socially just society. So as you see, we were really very much trying to embed our policy in the Green Party's principles and ethics. And I'll just read very quickly the key points of the 6 principles. Evidence-based, takes a public health approach, recognizes that adults should be free to make informed decisions about their own drug consumption, and that such freedom must be balanced against the government's responsibility to protect individuals and society from harm. Promotes international environmental responsibility in relation to drug use and supply consumption, opposes profiteering from the supply of drugs, and is honest in communication to the public about drugs. So those are our main principles. And as you can see, or maybe you can't, but I'll tell you, we are the only main kind of large party in England and Wales that has a such a policy. Of course, the Conservative government, the Conservative Party and Labour both have prohibitionist policies on drugs. So we're, it's one of our kind of, we also like to think of it as one of our flagship kind of social and racial justice policy, because during our time writing it, we were really attentive to the very uneven impact of drug policy, policing, criminalization, imprisonment, and so on particularly working class communities and Black and brown communities in the country. We also did think about the way in which drug use affects women, mothers, members of the LGBTQI community, and so on, and the way in which it's tied up, of course, with anti-immigration policy as well. So we tried to incorporate all of that. In the last 4 years, what we've mostly been doing as a group is trying to think about how we can work around what we call our short-term policies. Our longer-term policies are all the great things that we'll do in terms of regulation once the Green Party is elected and has a majority in Parliament in Westminster, which, hopefully we'll do next year. Next year, but before next year, what we're focusing on is a series of short-term policies which can be at least approached within the existing legal framework. As I didn't mention it, we're also, of course, looking very much at what's happening in the rest of the world, and the UK is really behind much of the world in terms of decriminalization, especially of cannabis. So we've been talking a lot about cannabis, but we've also been talking about other drugs. We've followed, and in fact, have been in conversation with various different police forces in the country who are instituting, for example, diversion. So making sure that people who are caught possessing a small amount of drugs for personal use are not criminalized, and instead they're diverted out of the criminal justice system through various measures. Also looking, and also more and more police and also members of the public are being encouraged to carry naloxone, which is, how do you call it?
It's a reversal for
reversal. That's the word I heard. Opioid reversal. So this is something that can be given to people who are overdosing on heroin, in particular, and opioids. We're also, of course, thrilled to see that in Glasgow, they're now setting up a safe consumption room where people who use drugs in Glasgow on the streets and other places can bring their drugs to this room and inject them in an environment where they're also in the presence of healthcare workers and other people who can support them. So those are some of the things that we're looking at and thinking about how those kinds of things might be implemented in other parts of the UK, in England and Wales, particularly where the policy applies to. And I just want to say one final thing. The other thing that we're always trying to look at is we think of the policy as a kind of it's a living policy. It's changing. We're aware of the context is changing. Having discussions. We had great discussion in our last meeting about the kinds of stories we tell around drugs and drug use and prohibition, and how we can tell stories to people who might be unfamiliar with our policy, resistant to drug law reform, the kinds of stories that will compel people to think about the importance of changing our drug laws. And also, of course, we're really interested in how those of you who probably all of you in the room are talking to people on the doorstep during election times, and how the drug policy might be relevant to your local area, because of course, drug use changes dramatically in different parts of England and Wales, as it does everywhere in the world. And so the policy needs to be relevant to people on the ground in that way. So that's my probably not so brief introduction. And now I'm going to hand back to Cara. And just to say good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming. Yeah, just to say we are on Zoom. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't come up to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. This event is co-sponsored by Transform Drug Policy Foundation, of which Alex is the CEO, and Alex will be talking more about Transform's work. Shall I give you anyone's chance? Yeah. But one of Transform's campaign, Transform have been campaigning for 25 years, using an evidence-based and a huge data approach, and they've convinced governments around the world to rethink their drug policy. But 7 years ago, they set up the Anyone's Child campaign, and that's the personal stories of people who've been affected by the war on drugs. And they've actually found that the rate of acceptance of the population of this kind of argument has accelerated vastly through the telling of personal story. So we decided we would share a personal story with you today, and I'm the person with the personal story, but rather than talk you through it, I'm going to show you this film, which I will say I made it 8 years ago, so there is some language in the film I wouldn't use now, such as clean, and probably addict as well. So the film's dated, but the story stands. Also, just a slight trigger warning that, especially if you have a young child, this can be quite upsetting.
My partner Jake was an artist, a poet, a dancer, a writer, a nursery nurse, and soon to be a fully qualified art psychotherapist. He loved to make people laugh. He told me when we first met that he had started to abuse alcohol and other drugs at a young age. He told me that as a teenager, he'd been caught, named, and shamed in his local paper. Being labelled a hopeless druggie helped send him further into substance abuse. Despite being exceptionally bright, Jake's teenage dabbles culminated in a crack and heroin habit. The death of his brother Roland from a heroin overdose and a long stint in residential rehab finally gave him the strength to stay away from all drugs, and when I met him, he was 5 years clean. But the cravings never stopped, and he would bury them in exercise. He completed long runs and triathlons, often dressed in costume for charities.
Yeah, I'm going to recover in the next hour or two. I'll be fine. My legs are aching. I'm tired. I'll be all right in a couple of hours. People with MS don't have so much use as small things.
When our son was 3 months old, Jake was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. The police investigation which followed reawoke all his teenage feelings of fear, shame, and judgment. And where his teenage feelings came, so followed his teenage habits. 5 months later, Jake relapsed. Though he had no connections where he lived, he was able to obtain heroin and crack in just over an hour. While the legal status of Jake's drugs of choice did not deter his use or his ability to obtain them, they did put us all at even greater risk than simply the use of the drugs alone. risks from interacting with dealers who would make repeated sales calls to chase the next purchase, risks he would use impure substances and wouldn't know the strength of what he was taking, and the risk of a fine or imprisonment if caught. Jake was a high-functioning heroin user, good at disguising his habit from the world. I thought he'd fully recovered from his first relapse in 2013, but in April 2014 he relapsed again, and this time it killed him. Jake was a beautiful soul. He was a fantastic father. He was kind and generous. He was a hard worker, but he could never shake the sense of shame about his past. I believe that if Jake's drug use could have been treated as the medical issue it was, rather than the criminal issue it wasn't, he would still be alive today. Father, partner, brother, uncle, son, grandson, friend, and colleague. The world is not a better place for the loss of Jake Kerr. If there's a chance my son will want to experiment with drugs other than alcohol, I want him to be able to do it safely. I don't want his entire future to be ruined for the sake of a silly mistake, or even a series of them. I'd rather he went to a licensed supplier than to a street dealer who could be selling him literally anything. I'd rather those drugs were properly researched and manufactured. I'd rather he had access to truthful and unbiased information about what exactly he was doing to himself. He has already paid too heavy a price of drug policies hinged on just say no. I believe, and many experts also believe, our drug policies have failed. They do more harm than good. They protect no one. Please support the Transform Drug Policy Foundation's campaign for getting drugs under control and help to protect all of our children.
Sorry, it's hard to speak after that immediately. Yeah, I'm Chief Executive of Transform Drug Policy Foundation. Not going to speak for long because I'm sure people have questions. Before I joined Transform, I saw drug policy as something that's really important, but kind of like over here. You know, I didn't really realise just how much it intersected with everything else. Obviously racial justice, and even climate justice. And I'm just going to briefly, there was a health poverty action report that came out a couple of days ago. It's so hot off the press that I've had to write down notes because I don't know it in great detail, but I strongly recommend people reading it because it talks about, you know, just how much the war on drugs is a barrier to climate justice. And I'll just give a few of the sort of key pointers that are from that report. One is about how it creates a powerful shadow economy, which actually destabilizes democracies throughout the world, particularly in the global south, and undermines governance, which makes it much harder to sort of meet you know, climate targets and so on. It also pushes drug production into the most remote biodiverse areas. So examples like the Amazon and places like that, particularly tropical forests. And also drug production profits, because of the way organized crime groups adapt, you know, in the same way that big corporations would, drug production kind of funds other illegal activity that harms the environment. So, and you know, poaching, all kinds of different things. There's a lot more detail in the report, but I'm just going to read a quote from Daniela Diaz, who's from SOS Amazonia. And they say, given the climate emergency and the new violations of Amazonian territories, it's essential for the environmental movement to think about the Amazon issue in an interdisciplinary way, considering the effects of drug trafficking and other social and territorial complexities. So there's loads more detail in that report, but I'll just give a few headline ideas. And then the other thing I wanted to briefly talk about is, I mean, I joined the Green Party only 6 months ago, and drug policy was one of the reasons I did as well. And I was a member of the Labour Party and a Labour councillor. And I was just so pissed off for many years with Labour's policy on drugs and other things. But and even sort of senior Labour politicians that I knew and know that were silent on drug policy because they felt that either it was, you know, an unfashionable cause, or it wouldn't play well on the doorstep, which we can talk a little bit about later. Or even just that their party leader, Keir Starmer, wouldn't let them speak about it, which is the situation now. But one of the powers of legal regulation of cannabis in particular, but other drugs as well, is that it sort of gives you the opportunity to reimagine capitalism for that one sort of commodity. And there's loads of different models, like this is sort of social club model that's been sort of brought in sort of Malta, where we've sort of transformed, my colleague Steve has kind of developed that model with Malta, which just completely cuts out big corporations because it's a social club model. But also in New York, Cara and I went to New York twice actually to meet the people that made the reforms there happen. And that's sort of widely seen as, in the US, as the one that really embeds social justice in an amazing way. One interesting facet about New York as well is the activists who made it happen, the experts, were pretty much all black. Like, unfortunately, in the UK, as our people know, the drug policy reform world is very white, and it's kind of unfortunate. And the activists in New York, there was a bill that came forward, and they said, no, actually, it's not good enough. So they brought a bill forward that would legally regulate cannabis and decriminalise and do lots of good things, but they said, no, it's not good enough, we deserve better. Should be a really hard decision in the UK because it seems so far away from anything positive on a sort of Westminster level. And what came in eventually hypothecated all the taxes that came in from cannabis and split it three ways. I can't exactly remember the proportions, but one into kind of training for people most affected by prohibition, predominantly black and brown people, education and health and treatment for people who needed it. And the other thing it did, which is even more interesting to me, is they gave preferential licensing sort of rollouts. So people from affected communities again got the first tranche of licenses, and they got training if they didn't have those business experience. So we went to the cannabis dispensaries in New York, and I think there's only 5 licensed ones now, and we went to maybe 3 of them. One of them is but purely educational purposes. One of them, and they're all very like clinical, they've got armed, which I'm not so sure about, but security at the door. And they're not fun or cool, or they're just kind of quite clinical. But the third one we went to, well, I actually wasn't there, you went to, is a charity that supports people living with HIV, is that right? And the profits from selling cannabis goes into the charity. It's amazing. And then the other one we went to was the first woman of colour owned cannabis dispensary. So yeah, so the really, really good way of giving economic opportunities. And we also went to Boston, which had a model that was pretty good, but not quite as good as the New York one. And I'll just finish by telling very briefly a story of a guy called Devin Alexander who we met. You don't want to show the video. We've got a video of him, but Cara doesn't like the lighting. Sorry. So I'll briefly tell the story.
Video snob. I made the film.
Yeah, Cara made the film.
That's important.
But in your own time, it's on the Transform website. Yeah. But we will show another video briefly of the OPC. But Devin, one of the most inspirational people I've met. I'll just briefly tell a few sort of steps of his story. I think when he was 17 or 18, he was arrested and beaten up by police, basically. He's a young black guy, but he was then, he's not quite young now. And he was criminalised for possessing the tiniest amount of cannabis, which they found somewhere in his car. It was him and his mate, dragged out of the car. And there was no issue. They weren't driving unsafely or anything like that. And they weren't under the influence. It was purely because he was black. And he wanted, at the time, he wanted to go into the military, I think. And it meant that he just couldn't. So he just had to completely reevaluate his sort of life. And then in Boston, well, in Massachusetts, they just passed regulation that had the sort of social equity training in there. So he got trained in like business and accounting and, basically how to run a business, because the legal regulation sort of built this in for free training. And he said he had like Harvard professors of business come in to teach him and things like that. And he became like a really, sort of genius business person. And then when they often sort of separate the licenses. So the best models don't let the same companies do growing, delivery, selling, etc. So they separated out. And he wanted to go into the delivery of cannabis. which sounds a bit strange when you're from a place where cannabis isn't legal, but then he realized that it wasn't profitable, the model that they had. So he brought together all the growers and the community activists to change the licensing model so that delivery could be profitable. And then now he's got his own business, and all his supply chain are Black-owned businesses. So the whole of his supply chain is Black-owned, like from the grower, and it's all local as well. It's all grown locally and so on. And he was named, I can't remember which year, but 2 or 3 years ago, he was the New England Young Business Person of the Year. So like just a really inspiring story. And in a weird way, had he not been arrested, and he wouldn't have achieved those things. I mean, he might have been a great person in the military. But yeah, so he's a really inspiring guy. I think, do you want to show your PC? Another part of, Carrie was talking about like local reforms and the overdose prevention centre in Scotland, which is going to open. We visited the one in New York, which was great because it was like a queer sex work project that also supported people who use drugs. And we went and visited this, and this, I think there's well, it might say in the video, but there's about 200 overdose prevention centres all over the world, and there's never been anyone in them who's died of an overdose. And they don't just reverse overdoses, they prevent them before they happen as well. So
yeah, and we like this particularly because the language that the people who work in the centre use is so positive, so it really destigmatising, and they're really, which you'll hear in the film.
Oh, it's the role.
We have close to 900 individual participants across the 2 organizations who use our overdose prevention center. And then we have over 11,000 utilizations of the overdose prevention center.
We do a full intake before they become a participant in the overdose prevention center. So they have to sign a release, make sure that we have permission to give them emergency services. We figure out what their different modalities are. We figure out what is their drugs of choice, what their living situation is.
Some of our intake questions are integral when it comes to overdose response, because we know when the last time they used work. A lot of times when folks go into this instant overdose because their tolerance is low, they just got out of prison.
He hasn't injected in several days, and then we make sure that we monitor. So she didn't leave right away. Came in at 1, left at 3. That's because what's out there right now, it can have an adverse effect, and it can kick in while she's gone. So we keep her in for a while.
Folks who work here typically have some sort of either medical or nursing experience. We do employ active drug users as well. Build trust within our relationship, but we give our participants an opportunity to work and to gain an income if they so choose. So this is our overdose prevention center, and it's pretty busy, which I like.
As they come in, we make sure that we welcome them to the OPC and show them how things work. So we let them know that if they need privacy, we do have these screens here that you see, but it's limited, right? Because we want to make sure that we have eyes on people. We are here to make sure that we're preventing anything, and overdose prevention is better than an overdose reversal.
So our smoking room, that could be crack cocaine, it could be K2. Those are the top 2 that get smoked here, but really anything that they so choose.
Oh yeah, we also have sniffing kits. So if they would like to sniff at their table, we'll have the clean straws, the card, and stuff in. We can only have 2 people in there because we have to have eyes on it. Right? One of the key things about this work is that we have to make sure that they're safe. And if you can't see them, they're not safe, right? Because there's fentanyl in the crack now because they feel like it's a cheap way for them to get people high. And the thing is, it's a cheap way to kill people.
This is one of our examination rooms. We have nurses that staff this program 5 days a week, 9 to 5, and then we have doctors that come in through our partnership with Montefiore Medical Center 3 times a week to see our participants do some wound care, test for HIV, hepatitis C, test for diabetes, so that our folks aren't relying on the emergency system. We also operate laundry and showers here. Also renovations, this is going to be turned into an actual kitchenette where we can hold meals for our participants. We use this a lot for groups. We'll have like HIV support groups or hepatitis C support groups, drug user support groups, sex worker support groups, groups for LGBTQ identifying folks. And sometimes if folks want to recover from an overdose outside, we'll bring them out here and they can just chill. And we also have a gardening program in the summer where we'll actually plant herbs and things.
Yeah, it was such good vibes, honestly. We were walking out. In some ways, you felt like you were sort of imposing a bit because obviously people were just using drugs around you and stuff. Everyone was really nice. We were chatting to the participants. It was so good. Sorry. And yeah, so I guess my final point is just that we've heard a lot about there's no climate justice without social justice. I would also say maybe there's no climate justice without drug policy reform as well.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
Can you just say a bit about how people get their drugs to use them in the OPC, just if people don't know?
Yeah,
But
so
they don't get them there.
yeah, they don't get them there, but they did tell us that, I mean, they get them in the ways that they would,
Yeah.
unfortunately, like still illegal supply unless, yeah, I mean, obviously if you can legally buy cannabis there, but yeah, that's the slight problem. They did say that they want to eventually try and sort of roll it out into having safe supply as well, which but the way it worked politically, just in case anyone's interested, because to get the overdose prevention centre, they had to, it was a bit like the one in Scotland, they had to get sign off that it wouldn't be prosecuted from, I think from like the mayor, like the district attorney and various different people. So it wasn't, you know, and it's got funding from the mayor, I think, or the governor, but I think the mayor, but it's like not sort of named for what the funding's for. It's like co-funding for the project, so it's not like funding for the actual overdose prevention centre. And so they had to be sort of really creative in the way that, you know, the Lord Advocate in Scotland, that's the way they've done it. They've just said we're not going to prosecute, basically. So it's not like that the government has passed legislation, it's just the Lord Advocate in Scotland saying they won't prosecute.
So next, this is Abdi, who is the founder of Coffee Freak, who's a trained accountant. We took his info from the internet. That is impressive, though. Who I'm going to let him actually introduce himself with the relevant information.
I am. Pretty much, well. I am, yeah, so I did train as an accountant, and I'm not even welcome on there. I set up Coffee Freak, which is a social enterprise in Tower Hamlets and Hackney. I sit on, I tried to chair an NHS England board, which is rooted in mental health liberation work, and it's challenging systems at the moment around the oversection, particularly of Black men across London. And we look at data and we call in CEOs and we use different methods to politely drag them. And I have an economics degree from the LSE, which is fancy. But I want to start to thank you for sharing the story. That was really moving. And in my culture, we speak about how generationally storytelling is so important, and that his legacy will live on generationally. So thank you for sharing that. I'm really sorry for your loss also. I connected with that deeply for many reasons, because I was also a high functioning user. While I was working at this particular accountancy firm that I won't mention, one of the Magic Six, and it was part of the pressure, I think, that, and also a lot of it rooted in adverse childhood experience, and without triggering anybody in this room, I couldn't get the help 8 years ago, and I decided to quit as a form of act of resistance, I think, and frustration, because I would go to the local mental health trust and even the foundation trust, and there's just no support for someone that looked like me. I'd go to a hospital that looked a lot like this actually, with whiteboard and grey carpet and a really kind psychologist, but we just didn't connect. So after 4 months of struggle, of more using, I decided to set up a crisis cafe in Hackney in East London. And actually, I think I would call it a safe hub use, because predominantly we were working with people that were using crack and heroin and other substances too. There was a public toilet, so we opened up that public toilet. We provided hot food, we provided advocacy support, and we still do. It's still functioning to some degree. We got in a lot of trouble locally for that, because people that were using would, of course, come into the space. And despite that, we had some support from the local mayor, who's not there anymore, unfortunately, for all sorts of reasons. But he did visit that space and a few other people, and it was quite well known. It was like a kind of official, unofficial safe use hub, which I was very proud about. We then launched into a second hub in Hackney, predominantly working with women, domestic violence survivors, women who were survivors of FGM and other challenges, and it's now a thriving space. We do lots of research, or try to, across London, which is rooted in social justice work. And I suppose if there's any kind of nugget that I was hoping to leave today is to kind of implore you to really stand with us, particularly marginalized communities, in relation to the deep inequality that exists around particularly young Black men and the disproportionate stop and search. We have about 121 active cases at the moment of police brutality across Tower Hamlets, Hackney and Newham, or East London, and we're advocating for those families. We're working with quite an amazing local legal firm to take the borough commander and his team to High Court. I hope that's our intention in relation to structural racism. In addition to that, the me imploring is around the revolution, I think that's needed in the drugs policy world, and the revolution of what's happening at the moment, particularly because of the overdose that we're experiencing. Last week alone, we had 7 clients, because we also sit on contract delivery work, and we're part of something called Project ADA, which is supposed to be positive, but I think can be very harmful for many people. Our work is to do outreach at night, so we work with sex workers, we provide harm reduction support from a liberatory perspective, and we provide overdose support and food, essentially. But the police also sit on this network. We have other groups in that network too. So it's a bit of a paradox, but it's not rooted in how we would like to see as a Black-led organization, more safe use hubs, more support for people that are sex workers, for the LGBTQI+ community, for people that are needing to use safely, and how to support people through overdose. And that's not currently advocated through this model. We also work with media. We have about 5 interviews that we, in the next few weeks, this Monday coming, we have The Guardian, they're doing a video piece with us around synthetic drugs. Again, I mentioned it, but in a bit more detail. In Birmingham a few months ago, in 1 week alone, there were 29 overdoses in Birmingham alone in 1 week. And in Tower Hamlets, where I live in East London, we're seeing back-to-back overdose at the moment, and also the issue of physical health decline for people that are using synthetic drugs because of the African, and a great report you did too, your organization around the African supply chain, which is at great risk at the moment, which means there's more mixed drugs that are in use in the community. So we're testing the drugs in our crisis cafe. We're working with another third sector partner, but we're also trying to create lots of good noise and trouble locally around both the data, but also working with media to work on their language. A few weeks ago, we worked with the Daily Mirror, and they used the term zombie, which really offended me. And so we're trying to create a model or tool to, across the Guardian, Independent, all the other outlets that we're working with over the next few weeks, to advocate for people that are dying at the moment, and also around synthetics. But what I, in conclusion, really passionately believe in is the model of liberatory harm reduction, how we advocate for people, centered in love, centered in liberation, how we can use data, but also how the Green Party, for example, because I think it's in a phenomenal place at the moment because of how wasteful or useless Labour is, and how violent and abusive and repugnant and disgusting the Tory Party are, that I think there's a great place. And I think people like me who who's not at the moment sitting with any party, is kind of needing support from Green Party colleagues to go out into community, to help set up spaces, to help us in outreach, to work in these crisis cafes, to set up these sort of liberatory spaces. And also, that Carrie's already explained, but use your policy to advocate locally and create disruption locally through your local mayor, if there's a mayor, or your cabinet lead, or your councillors, or working with youth groups, particularly Black-led youth groups. And that's what I kind of wish for, and that's our approach to activism over 20 years. And I'm really inspired by the work you're doing and what you're trying to do to disrupt the market. And we'll have to hopefully see what happens in Scotland in relation to their new innovative work. But really, it's just to kind of leave with you the idea that Audre Lorde, who was an incredible feminist and thinker, insisted on this idea that we don't live single issue lives, that what affects you affects me and vice versa. So that's what I would kind of encourage and plead for, and that you help create the disruption that's needed, but start hyper-locally, start in your own community, and help us create the disruption that's required at the moment. Thank you.
We're going to open up for questions in a minute. I just wanted to because lots of what we talked about has been quite high level, and I think there are maybe some ground principles it's just worth bringing up, which is Green Party policy is broadly divided into short-term policy and long-term. The short-term are measures that could be taken now within the current drug law framework, so things like drug trafficking festivals and in-town centres, overdose prevention centres, and drug diversion schemes, which is where the police will send, if they arrest you, will send you to treatment centre rather than to criminalise you. Then the long-term policy is what the full legal regulation of all drugs. Each drug would be treated separately. It would have appropriate health measures. People would look at the harms and benefits of each drug, and therefore it would be legislated. So whether you go to a pharmacy to get some drugs, nothing would be on a supermarket, and certainly we would not be advocating for commercial promotion in the way that alcohol, formerly tobacco, always work. So it's really about making drugs boring.
The official Transform slogan is make drugs boring.
So I just wanted to lay that out, and I'm aware that people that will coming from Green Parties around the country, especially if you're more rural, you may have very different attitudes. Oh, and then the last thing was to say that it feels challenging to stand up sometimes to people and say, I believe all drugs should be, we say legally regulated, not legalized, because legalization implies it's going to be a commercial free-for-all. But all drugs should be legally regulated. It raises eyebrows. So what we certainly found the Anyone's Child families when we first came together, we'd all lost people or had family members imprisoned, but there's stigma and there's shame in speaking out. So actually by meeting with other people who think similarly, it gives you the confidence to go out into the wider world and not give in to the stigma and shame that society and the media narrative wants you to feel. Any questions?
Just one quick thing, just to add, if anyone wants leaflets about local reforms and stuff that Cara said, oh, sorry.
I just, in terms of questions, because we've got one of our members on Zoom, if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind kind of coming up and asking it close to this computer so it catches it, and then the panel could.
Or I can repeat if anyone's got.
That's also true. If you want to remain, yeah, that's fine.
Are we doing intro? Are we doing intros? What are we doing? Fantastic. It's probably going to be. I'd rather sit if that's okay. If there's an issue, I can be loud. It's not a problem. I'm running the Southeast as a training party. I myself am a medical professional. I have one question relating to that, and then one not necessarily suggestion, but I thought it was a really good idea maybe to help fundraise. In terms of the naloxone, which you spoke about, how is that distributed? Because the way I know naloxone is it's an IV intravenous drug. Is it going to be a bit like, or is it already like the epinephrine pens where you kind of stab it in the? Oh, so it's like an IM.
Or there's a nasal spray as well.
There is a nasal.
But it's way more expensive, so it's not as
Okay. My other one as well. You were mentioning that Jake was a poet. I didn't know if it was worth as just a suggestion, and you know, take it or leave it. I think it was something I thought might have been a good idea for someone who is also a writer and has used it to fundraise. It might be worth if you've got them, to publish them and then have the profits go into the thing again. Because I think to have a poetry book that explains all of that, or even just all the writings and musings, I think would not only be creatively wondrous, I think it would actually generate a bit of revenue. I don't know whether or not you thought about
Well,
that.
actually,
I'm sorry if I'm
Jake's,
overstepping my mark.
no, Jake's mum actually did collect his poetry, and he's painted as well and was an artist and did produce a really beautiful little hardback book. But I think we never sort of thought there might be a wider appetite for it. So we just gave them to close friends and family and never thought of fundraising through it. And here's some, but thank you, that's a really nice idea. Jake's mum would like that.
If you ever were to rethink that, I'm happy to give details and I'm happy to try and
Well, give me your details and I'll send you a copy of the book. So you see what you think.
There's a community that would probably really like that or appreciate that.
Yes,
And at the very least, it's something that I can try and publish locally, but I also try and do it further afield if you wish. But yeah, I'll talk to you.
Thank you. And you're Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary Page, and I'm a new member in the Bristol group. I used to be a Lib Dem. In fact, I was the Lib Dem mayoral candidate in Bristol for a while, and I ran the Scrap Mayor campaign there. And as a young person, I was so involved in sport that I would always say, I don't need drugs. I get the high from the sport, I get the high from alcohol. Why would I need that? I've done this complete U-turn because of the experience that I have had in, I don't know, post 30. And I want to tell you about the experience in Bristol. Despite being a middle-aged, middle-class woman, most of my friends take drugs. Most of the bars, the clubs, I've not been in a single bar or club in Bristol, in the whole city, where there is not someone taking drugs. And I think that one of the most powerful things we can do is to make the ordinary public understand how prevalent this is and how risky taking unknown substances is for our young people. Because when I go to those clubs, when I go to Motion, when I go to Lakota, Dare to, Lost Horizon, any of those clubs, I see 16 to 18-year-old girls, because they're predominantly there. You see them in the queues to the toilets, you see them taking substances, you see them telling you what they've taken, combinations of cocaine and ketamine and alcohol and all of that, and that concoction without knowing what's in it is absolutely the biggest risk. And I for me, this is that's one reason. And then the other reason is the fact that organised crime is so embedded, unfortunately, with the police service, in my opinion and in my experience, that is so protected that certain people get to sell drugs and are not caught. And predominantly that's the white community. And it is not the people of colour who are protected, and they're the ones who are arrested. And I think we have to do this better. And I'm so passionate because when I saw Carla talk about drugs policy in a rational, logical, ordered way on Politics Live, that was one of the pull factors that finally brought me over the line, because I thought I would never ever see Ed Davey speak that way or talk about that. The same as you said with Keir Starmer, they wouldn't dare because they think it's this risky electoral thing to do. And I think the importance of the Green Party is being able to say, actually, this is so important for the health and well-being of not only our young people, but our whole society. And just think of the tax revenue that we could bring in that would then provide all of the services if you had a system where you legislate, you regulate, and then you tax. We are in a situation where the cost of living crisis, and we need to pay for the health services for those people. I cannot see a legal, logical reason why not to do this?
I wanted to add before the president, thank you for raising the question about taxation. We did consult with the tax and fiscal group. We weren't able to do great modeling around it, but was one of the things that certainly we considered when we were writing up the policy was precisely, this question about if drugs are regulated, then where that.
I'm
not profitable.
I think Green Party was involved with the writing, but the model that we take is that we don't want to create a system where you're encouraging people to take drugs so we can make money, obviously. But just to take that as a principle.
At the back.
Yeah, welcome back.
Yes, so Philip can hear you.
Firstly, apologies for being so late. The trains are a nightmare this morning.
Yeah.
I'm traveling from Croydon. Gary Kelly, Sutton and Croydon Greens. So just a couple of things. My experience is that I went clubbing during the 1990s. You know, a lot of people who took drugs, maybe I took them myself, nobody say. But it was in the days when there was things like ecstasy, cocaine, and the drugs were milder. There seems to be a lot of things going on now where drugs are actually getting stronger and there's even more risk to health than there was. There's no screening of drugs before people take them in clubs. If we do that, I think at the moment it's regarded as breaking the law. I just think it's making sure that somebody doesn't die, basically. But it's also I wanted to ask as well a question about drugs and consent, because I know like in the gay community, a lot of men are now taking what's called GHB and having chemsex, and then saying that they need to do this to have sex. But how can you then consent or say no if you're voluntarily taking this and then you're completely spaced out? There was an issue in Manchester with the man who was giving men GHB and then raping them. So that it's a really serious point, and we should be really looking at why do people feel they need to take drugs to have sex, and that the risk that it could cause to both their health from the GHB, but also the risk of being raped, abused, these other things as well. So that I think that's important. The other thing I was going to ask was about the environmental effect of drugs being the war on drugs at the moment. I don't know if anybody's heard about cocaine sharks. Yes, so these drugs were illegally tried to be smuggled into Florida. The boat sank. These tons of cocaine are under the water, and it's then affecting other, shark. Yeah, but this is really serious. It's the environmental effects. It's the things with MDMA where trees are being illegally chopped down, and there's nothing to replace those trees. So it's the huge environmental effect it's got as well. I think we should be looking at that.
Okay. Can I just mention a few? Yeah, thank you. Do you want to? So on potency, I mean, really simply, if you're transporting an illegal substance, it's much cheaper to transport a much stronger substance. So, the reason why fentanyl is prevalent because it's cheaper and much stronger than heroin. So if you're transporting a kilo of fentanyl or a kilo of heroin, the illegal market's going to transport the fentanyl because it's stronger for the price of transportation. And that's the problem. That's the reason why. And that is a response to the war on drugs. It's a kind of an evolution of the criminal market to respond to the capitalist criminal market.
Super strength drugs are a direct function of prohibition, in the same way that when alcohol was prohibited in America in the 20s, people drank moonshine because beer was bulky and didn't get you as drunk as quickly. So skunk is actually a function of prohibition. Crack cocaine is a function of prohibition. Sorry.
And on really good point on chemsex. My previous role was CEO of Survivors UK, which is the big national sexual violence charity, and we did a lot of work on chemsex in relation to sexual violence there. And actually, at Transform, I've been sort of speaking to old contacts who, like London Friend and others, to try, because we'd love to do something like looking at those complexities, but it's so complex because like legal regulation of even the most progressive services, LGBTQI drug services, probably wouldn't want to legally regulate crystal meth. So it's kind of like, what do you do as a levers of legal regulation? And GBL, which is what sort of replaced GHB in chemsex, is you can buy like, 4 gallons of it for like 20 quid online. So it's like ridiculous. And the dosing of that is, if you're a millimeter overdose, you're gone. So
And with alcohol.
yeah, and without alcohol. So it's a really complex area. And I don't know if
So we lost 18 clients during the pandemic. We ran 7 hubs, and 2 of those hubs were predominantly the hubs they used those 8 across the Hacking. So from 21 to 22, and of the 18, 3 were gay men who were also very prominently amongst chemsex groups, for example. And I think you asked a really important question around the human story. So why it's happening? How do you support people? How do we address the trauma? How do we, instead of doing more research that just sits on a shelf, how do we engage with the community? How do we do outreach? How do we carry out harm reduction? And often in my experience, I've seen right now we're supporting groups who are all very vulnerable, who are also attending quite commonly groups through Grindr, for example, which is an app for people that don't know. And we know. Just in case. Also can't do that. So speaking very seriously though, that it appears to us to be the vulnerable, particularly young people who are in certain groups. And I think that we have to create space for conversation. We have to open spaces for people to come in and seek help. And we have to provide more advocacy support for the LGBTQI+ community, especially at the moment. There are all sorts of reports that have been carried out, particularly around this topic, but not perfectly. So I think it's about the human story. How do we help people? How do we engage? How do we make sure we're not stigmatizing? Because we're not going to be able to address all the issues. But I think it's about creating safety. And I hope that's through what you're looking at too, Alex, that is your new research, that we actually focus on the human interest now of the stories.
Can I just throw in one thing? I know you want people to ask about the environmental. One thing that is, just off, kind of jumping off on the point about chemsex and the risks. I remember talking to someone at Release who was actually doing, making safe kits for men who have chemsex, everything from naloxone, but also to, although naloxone's probably less relevant in that area, but the straws with, and needles and so on. But one of the points that he made is that the stigma and the risk of being arrested is so great that's what sometimes can prevent people at a party from calling an ambulance if someone is overdosing or passed out. And there have been some horrible stories about that happening in saunas, and then men not getting the support they need because saunas don't want any trouble. And so that would go then across the board, this problem of people not wanting to call the police. You hear horrible stories with young people as well, the same kind of thing, seeing their friend get sick and not wanting to. So it's just making another point about how particularly communities who are more vulnerable are less likely to bring in a police or ambulance.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's because of the classification of crystal meth as a class A. The police probably will arrest you. And chemsex scenarios usually involve sharing with friends and so on. So you are essentially dealing a class A drug. So
okay, we've got a couple of minutes left.
Hi, Liz Dixon, North Norfolk, Green Party. When I'm at the door, what I'd like to do is a few more tools to explain in a sort of practical way, because I get asked about, well, how would that work? What who would they be paying? Who would be profiting from the drugs you'd be selling? Where would you get them from? Would there be different categories of things that you're selling, and to whom, and how might it work?
Thanks,
I'm happy to brief it. Yeah, I mean, this actually is a really good guide. It's our debating guide. It's a bit out of date, but it's really good, and there's loads. Feel free to take one. And it is complicated, but most models and what Transform advocate for is very similar to the Green Party policy anyway. I mean, almost to the word. I'm not saying we
did that quite openly.
But most models would favour like homegrown. If we're talking about cannabis, it will be people will be allowed to grow their own. we oppose, as do the Green Party, corporate capture, which is essentially big corporations coming and taking over the market. And then other drugs, it's about kind of risk and harm. So some of what we advocate for at Transform is like a sort of like a chemist, a chemist would prescribe stimulants would be prescribed in the chemist. You'd have a limited amount that you could purchase in a week and so on. So it'd be
when you say prescribed, who would do the prescribing?
Well, they'd be selling it, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't necessarily be on prescription unless if some riskier drugs like heroin will be available on prescription, as it kind of is, heroin assisted treatment. But then sort of more recreational drugs would be sold by a chemist, but they would have to give advice on dosage. It would be clearly labeled. And again, back to the make drugs boring point, we actually mock up packaging in our regulation. I mean, we've got loads of books, we can send you them, but they're quite long and detailed.
And the policy, the long-term policy actually outlines under each drug what we would propose, that the kinds of things that you're asking about, where would it be sold? MDMA is different from cocaine, for example, it's different from cannabis.
The way when I'm on the doorstep, the way I would summarize is to explain the current drug classification system is not fit for purpose. So for example, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, you can pick them in a field, but they're a class A drug. So you can go to prison if you've got a bag of them. And that just doesn't make any sense. So the relative harms of each drug, the penalties for it are not proportionate. If they were, alcohol would be a class A drug. So what we need is a modernisation of policy where the policy reflects the actual harms of the drug, but also, this is where the Green Party is quite radical, takes into account the potential benefits. And that's the part you can't really talk about. That's the part we all have to say, oh, I know a lot of people who took drugs. So it's about being a sensible, rational policy that's based in reality. And if you talk to a child and you tell me you can't take that, it's wrong, and they know their friends are smoking cannabis, then they're not going to believe anything you say, because you're saying nonsense that doesn't make any sense. So it's about a policy that actually makes sense and reflects reality.
I think what we also say as well when we're writing the policy, it is quite hard for people to imagine kind of current situation versus our policy, because it is quite extreme. And the questions I get from people are like, well, how would you do that? Like, what would you do on day one? And I was like, what we're proposing is a vision. And obviously, if we were in government, we'd work out the steps, because we know that there'd be a bit of transition and impact on the market. So I think what's really difficult is that it's not like housing policy and you're just going to build some housing and here's some housing. Like, it's really complex. So I think it is selling that vision and pointing to kind of what's currently, absurd and wrong with our current situation, and then selling that vision.
And a really good way to simplify it is what I say on the doorstep is, you've got two situations that are possible. One is, as it is now, free for all, organised crime groups controlling drug markets, making profit and growing, etc. Or you've got a legal regulation version where democratic state, however democratic that state is currently is questionable, but where you've got the state control. There's this kind of fantasy middle ground where drugs are eradicated. It's impossible. It's never happened anywhere. We've never even got close to it. So it's like, choose state regulation or organised crime groups regulation. They're the options, and the details, as Zoe said. It's the details kind of matter a bit less.
I just very, very briefly, we support quite a large group of young people in Tower Hamlets. When I'm busiest out in Tower Hamlets, young people, and we've lost some boys from London who are doing what's called CUNCH, and that's why I spelled it because and Norfolk is a very prime spot, so we're losing boys to Norfolk. And because of the supply chain of Norfolk. And I think, as someone, if you were knocking on my door, that I would first have that conversation about the risks and the issues that exist locally. That's what I would connect with if you knock on my door. Let's talk about problems first, and these are the solutions, and to keep it as simple as possible. Because often when people talk to their policy, they shut down. So I would talk about the challenges of Norfolk, and there are many, many challenges, particularly around, as I said, CUNCH, and also the issue of overdoses too. You have quite prevalent overdoses in Norfolk, and issues particularly around crack and heroin use, and people that are using it but don't have support. And then more recently, you've also had issues of quite serious violence. There's been more and more people who are dying. I don't know necessarily where you live, but I just mean in general, when looking at the issues that we know about boys living to have, is to go to where you are. So I would focus on the human again, the human story.
The drug policy working group is really happy to talk to anyone about their
Yeah, thanks.
local situation and.
So yeah,
we've done it
if
before
you
with
would like that for your
councillors.
local group, would like someone from the working group to come to your local group and talk about this in a workshop like this, we're very
I'm
happy
door
to do
knocking with
that.
you.
Please contact us.
We want loads of people to be talking about this, like obviously Zach said, like you shared,
Yeah.
like Zach talking about this yesterday as part of his speech was amazing, and you sharing that story about hearing Carla speak was the whole reason we wrote this policy, so Sean spoke to it in the election, so Clear Lake and Somerset spoke to it and running for police crime commissioner, like that's why we did this, so as long as to be able to talk about it.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Can I just make one more?
Yeah.
We are a small working group, like all working groups in the Green Party. We're of course all activists, we're volunteers, and we're always looking for more people. I mean, we could, at the moment, we're kind of working in the areas that interest us most. So there's some people who are really interested in cannabis. There's some of us interested in kind of exploring more of the safe consumption room options in England. But there's lots of room in the working group itself. There's a kind of a core group of about 6 of us at the moment, actually. So the more people we have from different parts of England and Wales actually in the working group would be absolutely fantastic. So please feel free to get in touch with us and yeah, let us know. And we're on Green Spaces. Green Spaces is a good place to.
How do we go about that? Just.
Green Spaces is a good way, or maybe we should.
We've got you to WhatsApp.
Yeah, we can,
So what's
adding you to
group?
our WhatsApp group would be a good.
And we're on Instagram, Twitter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
Yes,
yeah.
but please do, yes, if you want to carry these ideas further.
I think we did X.
Thank you. Thanks, Philippa.